Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, depending upon the place where you are. I am Madan Rehani. I am President IOMP. I welcome you all to this webinar. We have two very good friends today, Steve as speaker and Geraldine as moderator. I'll be introducing the moderator and then she will introduce the speaker. Dr. Geraldine Reilly, I have known her for the last nearly 20 years. We used to have interactions in the meeting of the European Commission for many years. She is head of the Medical Physics and Bioengineering Department at St. James Hospital, Dublin. Dr. Geraldine Reilly has been really active in Article 31 group of the European Commission. She also chairs a subcommittee of that group. She has been involved in many projects of European Commission as a reviewer as well as an expert. She is also radiation protection advisor to her hospital. With those few words, I will pass on the floor to Geraldine to continue with the session today. And I will then come back at the last while closing. Geraldine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madan, and thank you for both the introduction and also the invitation to you and the IOMP to moderate today's session. So to all of you joining us today, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. And I'm sure you're all looking forward to what promises to be another excellent webinar. I know that for all of us, the IOMP webinars have been a great resource over the last year, and they've allowed us to keep up to date with developments. They've also facilitated our communication and discussion in the wider community of medical physicists and allowed us all to keep in touch during what has been a very difficult time. It's my very great pleasure today to act as moderator for the session and to introduce our speaker, Professor Stephen Balter. Professor Balter, I know, will be known to many, if not all, in the audience, and he really has been an iconic figure in the world of medical physics and has always been as generous in sharing his expertise as he is knowledgeable. He's been a great friend and colleague to us here in Ireland, as he will have been to many of you who have joined us today. So Professor Balter is Professor of Clinical Radiology at Columbia University in New York City, and his primary clinical responsibility is in the high-volume interventional cardiology department. Professor Balter is ABOR certified, licensed by New York State in the areas of diagnostic imaging, therapeutic radiology, and medical health physics. He received his master's in radiological physics from Columbia and his Ph.D. in experimental physics from Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute. Professor Balter is an active participant in several physical and clinical societies. He's an elected fellow in the AAPM, the ACMP, the ACOR, the Society for Cardiac Imaging and Interventions, SCAI, and the Society for Interventional Radiology. He's also a member of council of NCRP, and he currently serves on three international, three IEC working groups. Professor Balter's interests are focused on brachytherapy, interventional radiology, and related health physics topics, and he has published over 200 papers, chapters, and books in these and related areas. And among these, he was chair for NCRP Report 168 on fluoroscopic guided interventions, and he served as an invited lecturer and visiting professor in many USA and worldwide venues. So the title of Steve's talk today is I tested this X-ray system. Is it acceptable for clinical use? So I'm sure, along with you, we're all looking forward to hearing this. So I'm going to hand over to Steve. And while Steve is getting his presentation ready, I'd remind you all to put your questions into the chat box. And please, if you'd make sure that your cameras and microphones are muted, so we've no interruptions. So Steve, when you're ready, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine, for the very kind introduction, and I'm glad to share some of the things we've been doing. And perhaps it's helped before I bring the slides on. The focus is going to be on diagnostic For the many therapy colleagues, I think the principles are the same, and the details should be sufficient for you to bridge across. Okay, screen should be up for you.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, it's fine, thanks.
Okay. And where this comes from is one of the IEC activities I'm on is developing a prototype for physics QA testing manuals that the equipment companies will supply with the equipment, which I think will be quite useful. As we did the work, I was assigned the task of discussing uncertainty in the measurements and across the various applicable domains. And this turned out to be interesting enough that eventually I was invited to do this talk. The standards world really is two correlated parts, the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission. The part of IEC that is pertinent to medical physics is basically 62B, which is diagnostic, 62C, which is radiation therapy. There's great misunderstanding of the roles of these organizations, and the parent organizations do not by themselves provide certification of equipment or assessment. All ISO IEC standards are voluntary. In some parts of the world, the regulators make the standards mandatory, which means they've got to be followed in great detail. A caveat in these areas, the standards are basically on equipment, not necessarily on the use of equipment. Manufacturers, if they declare compliance to a standard, even in the countries where it's not regulatory, this is important to the qualified medical physicist. And here I'm using the US term since medical physics expert is European. I'm not sure what the equivalents are in other parts of the world. To synchronize everybody, you make measurements as uncertainty. I don't want you to answer these, but we'll look at these as we come on. I've taken this voltmeter with a calibration certificate, measuring the output of this power supply is exactly 5 volts. This is what it indicates on the meter. What are the uncertainty that contribute to the measurement? What is the probability that the true output voltage from the power supply is more than 5 volts? Is this probability influenced by the accuracy of the voltmeters stated on its calibration certificate? And this is pure technology where medical physics judgment is needed. What is the consequences that the actual output voltage exceeds the measured 5 volts? And these are things which each of you, as you do your testing, needs to keep into account. We do measurements to determine the safety or performance of a device. These measurements have uncertainties. You use the measurement to decide the acceptability of the device. The question on the table today is, how does the uncertainty influence the decision? And what are the consequences of an incorrect decision? Basically, there are 4 possible decisions. You accept the equipment is working correctly and you go on and use it. You reject the equipment because it's unsafe or poorly performed, and this is correct. You also may accept poorly performed equipment, which can physically damage the patient in one of a number of ways. You can also reject incorrectly perfectly acceptable equipment, which may have consequences if alternate equipment is not available. So we're testing compliance with manufacturer specifications. This is basically an acceptance, and I'll show you in a few minutes what the manufacturers do to deliver acceptable equipment. Regulatory conformance at acceptance periodically per your local regulators. Fitness for clinical use. This is commissioning of the equipment, term that's actually better known to the therapy community than the imaging community, and periodic. Here, your knowledge as professional medical physicists as to the clinical use of the equipment and the consequences of a poor decision should come into play. Given that there is uncertainty, we're going to look at measurement-based effects. Clinical feedback I've mentioned, I'm not going to discuss any further. Generally, there are three stakeholders, each with different people, different test tools and processes. The manufacturer, which includes the installers and the service people, the facility, the medical physicists, the QA staff, perhaps radiation safety, and the regulator. The Venn diagram hopefully has some areas of overlap. It is never without overlap. I'm going to use the ISO definitions and standards, because these are well known to the industrial community and not so well known in the medical physics community. Of all the things that are here, I'm going to look a little bit at measuring equipment and measuring objectives. There's references there. At the end of the talk, I will give you some references. This and many others are publicly available at no cost, and you'll see the list. You can make direct measurements or indirect measurements. Both of these have uncertainties. For example, the density of this copper cylinder, you'd measure the lengths with a ruler directly. You'd measure using the mass using the spring scale, which needs its own calibration. Combine these to get to the density. If I look at X-ray tube voltage, it is possible to use a direct voltage divider across the X-ray tube terminals. And here you see an example of one of these from the 1960s. It's possible to measure these indirectly by measuring the characteristics of the X-ray beam. This can be done either analog or digital. On the extreme lower right, you see an analog voltmeter. This works from the physical principles of comparing attenuation in the Compton range against photoelectric matching the wedges. Of this derives from actually Rankin's third paper, where a similar test for beam hardness is described. So let's look at tools and procedures. System property under test, and I'll keep on voltage just to give a little bit of a focus. Manufacturer provides specifications. The regulators provide requirements, and the clinic has requirements which may match the regulators, or specifications may differ. You're going to use a test instrument. It has its own specifications. One needs to know the calibration lab processes and what's in the elements. In this domain, there are huge issues of congruence between the calibration lab and the medical physics test. And for those who are aware of this, the calibration lab spectra are quite different than most modern fluoroscopic and indeed radiographic spectra. There's another series of mismatches or lack of congruence between the calibration lab, how the manufacturer tests at the factory. A third layer between the manufacturer's factory tests and field service, and then field service and medical physics. It's sort of an endless Escher stairway to get these in congruence. Instruments have uncertainty. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm assuming that the correction factor is almost unity. In formal language, the measurement domain is described by a probability density function, which describes the location of the true value relative to the indicated value. The normal default instrument PDF is a normal distribution. I'll show you this in a second. the actual shape is generally unknown and in too much detail for today. So this is a normal probability distribution. In the world of metrology, what you see from the meter is always placed at the peak of the distribution. And then the PDFs gives the probability that the indication indicated by the star is in relation to the true value of the measured parameter. So the answer to that, if you measure exactly 5 volts, the chance, or if it's indicated at 5 volts, the chances that the true voltage is greater than 5 is 50%, no matter what the accuracy of your instrument is. Instruments come with calibration certificates. These, as medical physicists, we tend not to read as carefully as we should. The thing that needs to be looked at is what are the measuring conditions in the calibration laboratory. And occasionally there's shorthand, they're using an FH8 beam, et cetera, You need to understand what the measurement beams are for the calibration in terms of your use. It will give a correction factor under the calibration lab conditions. We're assuming it's unity, just to simplify life. There's a coverage factor, which is based on the normal PDF. And the uncertainty, that 3% I showed you, is based on a confidence interval using the expanded PDF. Roughly a K is 2, means plus or minus 2 standard deviations. So the plus or minus 3% meter, or any accuracy, the chances are 2.5% that the true value is above that, and the chances are 2.5% that it's below that. I'm going to work an example in a minute to show you how this functions. This is a piece of a calibration certificate, and you see how it's described, the traceability to these documents. Essentially, all of these documents are available online, should you care to do them. If there's questions as to the calibration beam, my recommendation is you talk to the calibration laboratory, get some better description of the calibration conditions. For this particular one, the statement is they're using the expanded uncertainty K equals 2, as I've just described. So the confidence is 95%. So our indicated 5 volts, there's a 95% confidence that it's between 4.85 and 5.15. The machine has an output. We don't know what that is. For convenience, we assume the output of any source is a rectangular distribution. It's somewhere within the box and 0 outside the box. This is, in metrology, the default for the analog output of a device, unless you have other information. If you're looking at the output of a guitar, it would be 6 peaks around each of the 6 strings. It's never the description of a measurement. Again, for this presentation, I'm going to simplify. I'm assuming that my instrument is normally distributed. The source is a rectangular distribution. I'm not going to discuss numerical combinations, numerical evaluations. Let's take an example. The Wappler company is decided after 100 years of making X-ray machines to make a mobile phone. Batteries just recharge using a power source. Engineering sets the acceptability limit based on its design. They know if the voltage from the power source is less than 10.5, the charging is unacceptably slow. They know if the voltage is above 13.5, you could destroy the battery, or even worse, set the phone on fire. engineering and Wappler management decides these are acceptable specifications. The engineers then go on and specify a power source as 12 plus or minus 1 volt. Notice the engineers have given a half volt on each side as a safety factor, and they design this with the expected PDF for the power source to be this rectangle between 11 and 13 volts. So here's the specification. The designer have taken a symmetric risk of undercharging or cooking the battery of 2.5% on each side for a total risk of 5%. This is an engineering decision, and this is something you have to understand while you're doing your testing, what these boundaries are. They contract to make these power sources. QA tests these with a calibrated voltmeter. If the voltage is acceptable, they ship the phone stamp QA approved. Let's look at these limits again. There are, in this example, a lower limit, which is an inconvenience, and an upper limit, which may be a real safety hazard. In general, in the work we do, nothing is falling off a cliff. As you go further beyond the limits, things get more dangerous. So you have to look at each of these values and decide where to put the limits. If you have a manufacturer, I'll show you, you may want to locally adjust your testing limits. So here are formal uncertainty definitions, ISO, IEC, which in this area actually work together, and many of these documents are joint documents. We start with the tolerance interval, and again, this is formal language in ISO IEC. For the phone example, the tolerance interval was 3 volts between 10.5 and 13.5 volts. This power supply was specified as 11 to 13 to allow a safety margin. We're now going to decide whether to accept it. The acceptance interval will depend on the tolerance and the measurement process. If I have a high uncertainty in the measurement, I will have a very small acceptance interval. Here, if I have a large, good instrument with small uncertainty in the process, I can have a much larger acceptance interval. If I put this together for our phone, you can see the tolerance interval, the specification interval, and because I have a good voltmeter, I can actually accept with these 2%, 2.5% on each side, differences, voltages in the range shown. So I can accept a little less than 11 volts, a little more than 13 volts, provided I'm willing to accept that I'm exceeding the tolerance intervals on the two sides. Part of your professional judgment is look at those arrows and decide if they are appropriate to your purpose. So here's decision making. We test for conformity with the requirements, look at the regulatory requirements, and very often regulatory requirements are absolute. The half value layer shall be greater than 2.5 millimeters of aluminum. The maximum radiation output shall be less than 100 milligrays per minute. These are stated as absolute values without any uncertainty. The benefits, presumably, of being a regulator. Much of the difficulties I have in dealing with regulators in metrology is they tend to regard the instrument reading as the truth. And this leads over the years to many interesting discussions. Excuse me for a second. The manufacturers give specifications. They usually give a plus or minus. The clinical intended use is your decision, and it got to be looked at carefully. Again, equipment that falsely passes a test can be inadequate or physically dangerous. Rejecting equipment can be economically expensive if the patient goes to the next hospital for diagnosis or treatment, and can be a real health risk is if you're taking something offline unnecessarily and the patient has nowhere else to go. So these are more than check boxes. These are things in both instances that affect patients' health. One strategy you may want to do, given the tolerance interval, and here I'm showing for my power supply, you know your instrument, use the K factor and decide what the maximum and minimum voltage is, always putting the error bars in the favor of rejecting the equipment. Again, with the K equals 2, if you do it this way, there's a 2.5%, you're still actually over the limit. Depending upon the risks, you may want to place your limits at a different point. And this becomes a judgment that you should look at. For example, I might move my acceptability limit to 3 sigma to bring it to less than 0.1% that I'm going to set the phone on fire. Don't always go with the K factor. Look at the risks and decide whether or not you should expand the uncertainty and narrow the acceptability range. Moving on to a few hints on installed equipment. And I'm going to look at a few things in the fluoroscopy domain. My apologies to those of you who don't work in this. The principles are basically the same. Hopefully this will help you, even though I'm not going into details. Generally, we're doing indirect measurements by placing a measuring instrument probe in the beam. Manufacturers do their best to deliver equipment that performs properly, that meets specifications. They treat this very seriously. They have elaborate systems to do this. Part of the process, as they develop equipment and do the type testing, they do uncertainty budgets. In the manufacturer's world, this is called risk management. They maintain careful files which the regulators inspect to see whether the risks are adequately managed. This is good practice. The manufacturers rely on test houses, which are independent laboratories, to see that the equipment actually meets the specs. They will generally test against claimed IEC standards, other standards. You can find which standards the manufacturers are using by the labeling on the equipment, and this can be quite specific. There is some very marginal equipment out there. If you see something where the claim is it meets ISO standards without a number, the chances are that it has been tested against anything that you care about is rather low. Look at the labeling, look at the standard. The more detailed the standard relative to what you do, what the equipment does, the better you have assurance that this part of the chain has been done properly. Test houses may be asked by the manufacturers to test against regulatory requirements in the areas that they work. This is generally a factory operation. The manufacturers have an elaborate QA process because they have to maintain the chain of accountability. So when they manufacture, they use formal procedures. They use a lot of measurements that nobody else can do, including their own people, once the equipment leaves the factory. They use very specially designed test equipment and software. Again, this is generally not portable, so it's only seen in the engineering lab and perhaps in the production line. They may do indirect measurements in production or in installation based on type testing and risk management. This is essentially a form of constancy testing, and we'll say more about constancy testing in a minute. They will claim that installed equipment conforms to IEC standards based on the measurements. One of the best examples of this is X-ray tube housing leakage, where the manufacturers essentially will test each housing before shipment in a 4-pi geometry, something that just can't be done in the fields. The conformance is certified to the regulators and perhaps to the medical physics community with the labeling and written certification documents. One of the things being discussed in IEC is to make the individual serialized documents more readily available to the end institution. So let's back to tube voltage for a minute. Some of the things they're doing, equipment may have an internal voltage divider. The voltage divider will be tested. They may do direct measurements with their standard voltmeter at the tube terminals. They may do indirect measurements. Again, their process is in the risk management. They have their internal threshold. Equipment is now shipped and installed. Manufacturer's team has specified equipment, measuring conditions, and procedures. They're going to use this internal voltage divider if it's provided. They may use a very specific indirect voltmeter. And again, this is factory saying use model 1, 2, 3. Look for this as a constancy test. It's not an absolute test. Enter the medical physicist to do testing. And here's where the IDC is concerned. If the physicist tests close to the manufacturer's test conditions, data in the instructions for use is valid to see, does my installed system meet the specifications, including the tolerances, and trying to do this in a way that doesn't mean you use a very specific instrument is of great concern in our working group. Physicists commonly test in manners that are not close to the manufacturer's test conditions. You look at two issues. Are the measurement conditions close to your instrument calibration conditions? And I will give a hint in terms of radiation output. Most diagnostic dosimeters are tested with relatively soft X-ray beams. Many modern beams are very highly filtered, so one has to look at the energy dependence and the energy compensation to decide if your measurement are very different than the calibration lab. Again, understand the calibration lab so you understand what you're seeing in front of you. Because of all these permutations, one gets into endless discussions. Yes, it passes, no, it fails, because different people are using different instruments and different processes and different standards. Once you've done that, constancy checks should be done. You set up the limits during the physics level testing. You need stable measurement conditions and you need stable test tools. And again, mismatches between the regulators' processes and instruments and the clinical physics are not uncommon. So these have to be factored in as well. So here's the tube voltage. I'm measuring the voltage, putting a sensor in the X-ray beam. I can't get at the internal test points because it's locked, it's dangerous. I have no way of setting the KV and beam filtration. This is improving in newer systems that will have a QA mode. And hopefully this becomes more fully deployed in the next couple of years. And almost always your instrumentation as physicists will be different than the tools the supplier uses. Be careful of the spectra. You have to understand the relevance of the uncertainties in your testing against the specified tolerances. 2, where the measurement perturbs the thing, many radiation probes have attenuation elements in some cases, as shown. This is a lead sheet that's put behind the sensor to avoid backscatter from the tabletop. Other instruments are more transparent. This is an example of a solid state detector. This is about a 50-year-old ion chamber with a very heavy metal stem. If you get in the beam, it will cause a shadow. If you're testing with automatic dose rate control, you will drive up the reading. In one manufacturer's QA manual, the recommendation is whatever probe you have, if they show you where the measuring field is, tell you to keep the probe out of the measuring field. Use this information if you have it. You've got to look at additional considerations based on the mode. The big thing these days are spectral influences and how they affect things. The software, how it does the averaging to get rates, how the compensation is done. These are things you've got to talk to your instrument manufacturer. Here's an example. This is brand new, an AAPM EFOMP on calculating patient skin dose based on references. They give a very extensive table of uncertainties. I've looked at the air kerma at the reference point measured by the medical physicist. This standard requires 5% inclusive with the coverage of 2. This is a fairly tight specification. The IEC requirement is plus or minus 35%. This is historic because at the point it was written, it relied on direct beam instruments, which had their own uncertainty of 25%. Generally, manufacturers will provide tolerances that are much tighter. You've got to look at this, see how this fits the standard. And I won't spend any time on it now, but you can see a typical setup for making this measurement. Constancy testing. Manufacturers provide tools, and one new one, which I've just seen in a system we're installing right now, close the collimator, look at the indicated maximum air kerma rate. This is sort of neat, requires no tools. Manufacturers generally self-monitor the systems. If there's something the machine doesn't like, it will display an alert. One of the common things that was there, almost universally ignored by the physicist, in the days we were physical beam monitors, they would separately calculate the expected output, put up a warning if the measured value was too far from the calculated value. You're going to have QA run constancy testing in your institution. You should not rely on the physicist measurement instrument for everything, but you've got whatever tools you use, establish it. Protocols should be stable, simple tool for output, fixed geometry, put a hunk of plastic in the beam, all the indications, what you expect. You've got to tell the QA team that's doing the constancy what the acceptable values are and a rejection strategy. It might be call the physicist and retest. If it's too far out, you might want the equipment immediately taken out of service. These are professional judgments which you as a physicist need to make. Few final hints. When you look at the measurement instrument, look at its functionality. You finally got a budget to buy a new one. How does this fit with what you have? What are the gaps? Will the manufacturers accept your new instrument? Will the regulators accept the instrument? Look at the traceable calibrations, instrument manufacturers, specifications, calibration lab. Particular issue is many instruments now provide a half value layer. Reading, there is no international standards. There's no traceable calibration for indirect half value layer. Look at this carefully. Again, look at the specifications if there's now no uncertainty. For example, if the statement is you shall not go above 100 milligray per minute, you can't accept 99.9 as pass and 100.01 as failing because of the PDF. So you've got to set your boundaries to match the accepted risk. And this is a professional judgment. Typically, people will use the 2 sigma, perhaps the 3 sigma if something is critical. And you do this by accepting the limit. On the system I'm installing now, to keep peace with the regulators and their processes, I've asked the installer not using his process to go above 90 milligray per minute at the reference point, which gives me very high assurance that no matter whose instrument is used to test it, I won't be above the regulatory 100. We're doing this to manage risk, radiation risk. We're doing this to manage imaging risk. Imaging, if the radiation is too low, there are noise issues. These depend on the targets. Receptors have dynamic range. Image contrast will be affected by the targets. In addition to the X-ray spectra, there are influences on the receptor lookup tables, post-processing. You need to look at the clinical requirements and decide what tolerances can be accepted. This, again, is a professional judgment. With that, I'll conclude my talk, and I will show you the list of documents that are available. I've checked all of these in the last 2 weeks. These are all downloadable at no cost. And here's another batch. The only one where there's cost involved is the IEC guide. And this is brand new, but not accessible without going behind the paywall. I would recommend this AAPM EFOMP paper from last month because it does an extremely good analysis of uncertainty in a clinical situation. With that, I'd like to thank the IEC clinical team who inspired/dragooned me into putting this together. First version was internal. It's grown from there. My colleagues at the Columbia Medical Physics Department, I present this journal club, and Peter Balter at MD Anderson, who ran the regional calibration lab for a number of years. And we just missed World Metrology Day last week, where the topic this year was measurements for health. There's a lot of things that you might find interesting on the website. Uncertainty is certain. With that, I'm open for questions.
Steve, thank you as always for a wonderful presentation, and thanks for taking us through the basic concepts and terminology in the world of instrument calibration and measurement uncertainty. So we have a couple of questions already in the chat, but maybe just before I move to those, you've mentioned a couple of times the sort of tensions that exist between the in-house physics testing and the suppliers and the challenges really in testing in a way that we can both agree on the acceptability or otherwise of a system. What can be done or what moves are afoot to bring us to an easier relationship with suppliers on those occasional difficult times where we disagree?
Recognize that everybody is, including the regulators, is working in good faith, and don't adapt an adversarial position. And in fact, the main reason why the IEC is developing this new series of QA manuals, or the template for QA manuals, is to help bridge some of this difficulty.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I found this on the web for a series of QA manuals for the template for QA manuals difficulty. Check it out.
Sorry, my Alexa went crazy.
That's okay. So we've a question in the chat from Jim Weston. So if we're measuring a dental unit having a beam output of 71 kV, how much filtration must we have? So can we bend the stated numbers in the IEC documents in light of the instruments we use?
Dental, as far as I know, tends to be relatively lightly filtered compared to some of the things for heavier body parts. And I would guess that dental, the calibration of the instruments that you're using is fairly close. Fortunately for half value layer, very few manufacturers are anywhere close to the minimum filtration. And the typical half value layer specification is greater than. So I think look at what's doing, set your acceptable minimum filtration. And I've never seen a problem where I'm so close to minimum filtration, I have to look at instrument uncertainty with any care. My problem is the other end with maximum outputs.
Okay, thank you. Next sort of question stroke comment was on from one of our colleagues, is that I've been advised on the practical difference between a witness and an expert. So the witness is required to state facts and an expert is required to give an opinion. And the question really relates to findings as a physicist where one of the X-ray systems was found to have some slight underfiltration. And the question to the fairly new physicist at the time was, would you advise a suffering patient to accept this machine or go to another hospital? So I suppose the question really goes to, are there circumstances in which we should relax the tolerances or the technical specifications with which we require a system to comply?
This is a judgment. I think if things are marginal, one has to discuss with the practitioners and with the facilities administrators, explain how far over the edge you are. What are the things? If taking, for example, the only surgical C-arm out of service, and it was in the trauma department, and the next trauma department was an hour away, one might be more lenient than if it was just bringing a new machine into the room. It's really, this is really where expertise is needed. Careful consultation, discussion of risk management with the appropriate individuals in the facility is extremely important. This is not write a report saying it failed, so you can't use it anymore and walking away.
Thank you. So comment or question really, in some countries, the regulator would allow technicians or radiographers, as we would refer to them, to measure dose output and imaging characteristics. But the findings from, that professional group might often differ with those findings of the medical physicist. So how do you deal with that? Is that something that is an issue elsewhere?
I think this is local. In the US, in New York, are my regulators, I'm allowed to have an assistant do physical measurements, but I'm always responsible for the report and any discussions and decisions based on this. Again, in areas where imaging physicists are not so plentiful, the decision may be to give the technologist QA people more authority. Simply, this is the best that can be done under the circumstances.
Okay. So there's a question about commercially available QA kits that are recommended or used. So I'm not sure whether that's advice that you can share with us, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, this is in context. Getting a kit to start with, and again, I think all the instrument manufacturers and kit manufacturers are really working very hard to make these as applicable as possible. One has to look to see if the design of the kit fits the local circumstances. For example, in some parts of the world, the image receptor characteristics are tested by placing the test object right on the image receptor. In other parts of the world, the same properties are tested by placing them in a patient position with a gap. So one has to understand how the particular kit, particular tools fit local professional and regulatory requirements. But generally, getting a kit is a convenience.
Okay. Another question, which is probably a challenge we all face at times, about getting the funding really for the purchase of these tools. So how do you convince management that they're not just nice to have, they are essential?
Blame the regulators.
Okay.
They will always find money. The other thing is you might consider, when the facility is buying new imaging or therapy equipment, to ask that a small addition be made to provide the QA test equipment.
Yeah, I think that very often the cost of the test equipment is dwarfed by the cost of the equipment, so that's often a good approach. Yeah. Okay, we have a question about testing systems where we don't have a clear idea about uncertainties. So the specific example given is about measuring mean glandular dose in mammo, and you determine it's 3.1 using lookup tables. So do you reject on that basis?
Well, again, all of these lookup tables for the mammo are based on essentially a dosimeter reading and perhaps including the half value layer. So the uncertainty derives from the measuring instrument, and one has to understand this in context. If the instrument is poor, the table won't work. If the instrument is good, any of the published tables should be usable with high confidence.
Okay. Another question, sometimes when we test a system and it complies with the relevant guidance documents or standards, and we hand it back to the clinicians, and yet they find that it doesn't meet their requirements. How do you address that difference in, it's passing all the tests, it seems to meet with both manufacturer specifications and relevant standards, and yet the clinicians say it's not fit for purpose? So this is possibly something that you might encounter at the beginning of an equipment's life, or possibly towards the end.
Well, it also can happen in the middle. This is my biggest problem. I no longer am confident as a physicist I can objectively test image quality in a way that means something for the clinicians. And this is a topic of a whole different talk. The clinicians are incredibly sensitive to this. And in my environment, I have people doing similar procedures, complex procedures in different rooms. And even though my physics tests are the same in both rooms and the nominal dose rates are the same, I find in the room where they don't like the image quality, they're actually using more radiation on the patients. Extreme example is I had a room we spent a lot of time commissioning. The service engineer retired. The replacement engineer came in and reset everything to factory defaults. I heard it from the physicians within 2 hours on the next day. And to make things worse, the engineer didn't save the old settings.
Okay.
The company was quite embarrassed, and it took a panic response to get it back to where we were before.
Okay.
But yes, our goal is not to optimize per physics, is to optimize per clinician's need.
So a collaborative approach with the clinical people and the suppliers.
And one of the things I'm starting to do for some of our critical exams is we're going to ask the clinicians at the close of a case to give an image quality rating on a 1 to 5 scale. And I'm also, second question, did you have to increase the dose rate? I'll use this as feedback for my physics testing.
Okay, so great idea that I think some of us will take on board. Maybe just keeping an eye on the time, maybe one last question. How would you see the future of QA testing? Do you think in 10 years' time we'll still be going into X-ray rooms with measuring instruments, or do you think that this will change with machine learning, AI? Or are there things in the pipeline that will change how we do our routine work?
I think the image quality is something, again, because of what I've discussed before, is harder to test. Radiation output and similar things, I think, are essential. These are complex machines. We're in an environment where a clinician will complain if things are too poor, will never complain if things are too good. Part of our safety is to make sure they're not too much better than the physicians need to do the work and minimize the risks to the patients and actually in fluoro to the docs as well.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And it just remains to thank you for a wonderful presentation as always. I think it's really taken us through the basic concepts in a very clear and helpful way. So thank you for that. So with that, I am going to hand back now to Madan, who will tell us about some of the forthcoming webinars. So again, thank you, Steve.
My pleasure. I'm glad to have the opportunity to present this work.
Unmute. Thank you, both of you. And it's really my pleasure to thank Steve for the wonderful presentation. He has wealth of experience from the time of testing to the managing on behalf of IEC, a task group, so from at all levels. And thank you, Geraldine, for keeping to the time and moderating the session very ably. I will just talk about the some steps. So when you go to the IOMP website and go to the webinars, click the webinars, and then you have the next webinars listed. So after this, the next webinar is on 15th of June on radiotherapy topic, CTV and PTV in stereotactic radiosurgery. I encourage you to participate in that. And then often we are asked about the recording So on this page, IOMP webinars recordings. All the webinars are recorded, and within 24 or latest up to the 48 hours, they are placed there. For example, if you go to the recording page, you will find the webinars which were done previously. Their recording is available there.
As a reminder, all those references I gave you, you should be able to access from the recordings.
All right. And as a final thing, that we do not give any certificate of participation because that is something which is often asked. So this is purely an educational activity, and that's it. With that, I would like to thank again the speaker as well as moderator as well as Magdalena Stuber for providing all the technical backup, and thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar. All the best, and now we will close. Thank you so much.